Hello everyone, and welcome to another OVA overview here on Obscure Anime Memories. Will today's production of The Weathering Continent top The Puppet Princess? Well, not quite. I mean, Puppet Princess is a very high bar to clear, but 1992 The Weathering Continent is still a very fun little watch, and I would recommend it to anyone who wants to dip their toes into early 90s fantasy OVAs, as it's relatively short, it has a concise plot, it's relatively family friendly, it has decent characters, and some stunning visual and audio work alongside all of these things. And here, of course, we're going to take a look into all of this. I also want to quickly note, though, that this film is a neat little standalone adventure based upon a much wider pool of source material, that being the serial novel series by the same name, penned by Sai Takekawa. And while I have not read any of these books, I think it's important to note that this film can and does stand on its own in a vacuum anyways, so one is perfectly capable of enjoying the film without knowing anything about any of the source material, and I think that being able to stand in a vacuum is a mark of quality for something like this. Anyways, opening as we always do with a brief plot overview, the opening crawl of this piece explains that it takes place in Atlantis, and that Atlantis was once a powerful and lush unified state, but ecological disasters have, by this point, long transformed it into an anarchy-rich wasteland whose population barely manages to get by. This then cuts to our three heroes, Lakshi, Tie, and Boys, who are simple nomads drifting about Atlantis. In the OVA, they don't really have an established goal beyond the continue moving about, although I'm sure this is expanded upon in the source material. The three simply want to get to the next water well, when they come across the scene of an ambush and are almost ambushed themselves by one of the survivors. The survivor quickly apologizes for attacking them and then dies in Lakshi's arms as she grants her request for one last drink of water, although not before she can reveal her name. Anyways, needing water themselves, the group then enters an abandoned city hoping to find some, only to learn that it is the legendary city of the living dead, Aztec Sistra. Now trapped and pursued by bandits hoping to loot the legendary city, Lakshi falls down a pit, Boys goes after her, and Tie meditates in this room to try and calm the angered spirits, so angered because of all of the violence and disruptions that are taking place in their city. While Boys does succeed in finding Lakshi and the two eventually reunite with Tie, Tie fails to calm the spirits, who lash out once the bandit leader breaks the cursed seal of the city. This means that the totality of the curse of Aztec Sistra is released, and the masked manifestations of the dead suck the bandits to death. Before doing this to the main cast, though, they do recognize them as not as bad as the bandits and offer them a chance to live a life of death and join them. Although Lakshi shuts this down, as she doesn't want to be a ghost forever, basically. Now very angry, the masks draw closer to our reunited protagonist and do seek to do the suck this time, although the ghost of the girl from the beginning saves our heroes and reveals her name as Rifas. She is grateful for her last request to have been granted, and tracked down the heroes to make sure that she could give them her thanks, her name, and inadvertently save them in this dangerous journey. All of this allows Tia to finally cast a spell to guide them out of the city of the dead, and along the way they find just enough water to go on to the next well. The film then ends when they manage to make their way out of this city to the quote true original city, only to find that it was the ruins that the film opened in, and for Boys to lament that all things return to the earth. Although this isn't quite the end though, as while this is kind of a downer, the group trudges forward onto their next well, and onto their next adventure. And that gets us into the examination portion of this video. Now, as bleak as the ending may seem, I think it's fitting for the piece and its overall tone, and it's not a complete downer when we look at it in more detail. While the Wikipedia page on this OVA decries it as a mopey and slow mess, for some reason, I never found the piece to be anything like that. Instead, I found its tone to be a very grounded and objective one, and in fact, I think the tone is one of the most interesting aspects of this OVA to me, as it isn't very dark or serious, but there is a definite level of somberness, measurement, and objective acceptance of the harsh circumstances present. While no one mopes outside of a few logical and glancing complaints here and there, and the cast even has some lighthearted banter, they're also keenly aware of how bleak everything is, and that they just need to keep going. In fact, Just Keep Going is kind of the main theme and tone of this piece, as it's basically all the cast really needs to do, and ultimately can do, in this wasteland. The quest for water even adds a sort of ticking clock element to the movie, and a material element to this need to continue pressing forward. I think it fits very nicely with it. And all of these things lend the OVA a nice and balanced tone, which acknowledges issues present, but doesn't pontificate them to the point of being a detriment to anything else or reaching a level of impracticality. The heroes will see a tragic or brutal scene, and they will take time to respectfully go, "That's not good, I'm sorry that this happened, and that is unfortunate," but then they move on, realizing that if they don't, they too might also meet a tragic fate. And the ending is in line with this, as it does state the very objective and somber statement that all from the Earth must return to the Earth, but then it also says, "but not yet," as our cast continues on their journey once more, and seems equipped to do so for at least a little while longer. I do really like the ending and tone of the series for this reason, as they both feel very nice and measured. Not completely dark, but they're not completely lighthearted. It feels like a very grounded approach to this kind of thing, and I really like it, and it makes these people feel like people who really do live in this world, because in post-apocalyptic pieces, it's important to remember that this isn't something that happened overnight. This is just how these people live, and it adds a grounded element to these kind of productions that you don't always see, but I really do appreciate it. And it adds a measured dimension to the piece as well, and I want to say that this is a very nice, measured piece. And in line with this is the excellent setting craft present, which matches the tone near perfectly. The world of Atlantis is ruined and horrible. Yes, it has been for a while. Yes. But there is still haunting wonder to be found if one looks. If there is anything about this piece that I'd like to highlight the most, it's its visuals and design elements. While there isn't the most movement in this piece, I can tell that the budget wasn't necessarily the highest, as evidenced by the limited action scenes present. All of this is fine, as the stills themselves are gorgeous and magnificent. Watching this OVA felt like watching an art gallery come to life, and all of the random details present make it really feel like a world that was at some point lived in, and now feels like a former husk of its former glory. It's a somber and fantastical setting, yet even in a literal city of the dead, I didn't find the piece to be quite eerie, and I mean that as a compliment because I think it does enhance that aspect of the OVA that I mentioned earlier, that it does feel like just a thing, like this is just an objective thing that exists and that our heroes have to work their way through it. As Tia respectfully salutes the dead of Aztec Sistra and simply accepts it as a land of spirits going about their daily spirit lives, so too does the setting work salute the entire premise of a city of the dead as just that. It's just a city where the dead do dead people stuff, and there's not that weird. They've been doing it for centuries now, really. And there's no real attempt to play up any sort of horror element, there's no attempt at jump scares, and there's no attempt at any exploitive elements like that. But instead, it's just a measured trek through something which, in this world, is just kind of a thing. I love this because it makes the world feel closer to me, exactly because how everyone in the movie seems to just accept everything at face value and move on with their own quest. And yet, the fact that this is such a bizarre and fantastical setting creates the slightest disconnect, which draws me in as a viewer. Often the abandoned can make for fascinating settings, especially if we, the viewer, take part in the discovery process alongside those on screen. And it works excellently here. In fact, while the piece is nothing like Angel's Egg, it's probably the closest anything has come to invoking the same kind of mysterious and ethereal vibes that Angel's Egg gave to me. And I love the settings and visuals of this piece. They are true art. I also really like how the grand scope of the setting and art present greatly contrasts the simple goal of our protagonist. Yes, Aztec Sistra is literally the El Dorado of the dead and promises great treasure, but that's not the point here. Instead, Tia, Boys, and Lakshi, they simply want water, the literal bare minimum for life, so that they can continue on existing. And this contrast shows their humility, as they never seek any riches and they respect the dead, and it also shows the dire circumstances present. Yet the fact that they stay locked onto this task, and they pursue it so calmly, also makes it feel as though that this is just a thing. It adds to the objectiveness present, and I really like that. It makes them feel small, and also lends a sort of intimacy which isn't always provided by the characters themselves. Yes, the setting and lore is grand, but the actual objective and the people pursuing it are quite small in comparison. And I think this contrast works really well, especially in a fantasy piece which wants to evoke wonder. The audio, too, is something I quickly wanted to touch on for a second, as while an hour is not the longest time to really flex an OST, the OST here is a very, very good one, as every piece is great and fits the story near perfectly. In fact, I would say that the OST is worth a listen of its own while you're doing stuff around the house or something, even if you don't want to watch this movie. And I also want to quickly compliment the production staff for not falling victim to OVA syndrome. This syndrome manifests when a team tries to fit too much stuff in too little of a time frame, resulting in anything from truncated plot and character developments to straight up incoherence. Instead, everything here fits relatively well together, and the abandoned setting not only lends an air of mystery to the movie, but provides a pass to not fully flesh out every single detail of Azta and Sistra, although to be fair, many details are. And yes, the characters are a little bland, but there's no massive character scene that derails the rest of the plot by eating too much screen time. And in their defense, the characters are still likable and competent. Yes, the plot is relatively simple, but this allows it to facilitate the visuals and happenings present very well. Everything in this piece is measured, and for that reason fits nicely together. And while I find the visuals and tones of the Weathering Continent to be its strongest points, that's not to say that anything else here is bad though. In fact, everything at least is pretty competent. Getting to the cast real quick, while Lakshi, Tie, and Boys are not particularly developed or interesting, they are still likable, a little defined, and get the job done. Boys is the strong and quiet warrior of the group. He's serious, and he gets the job done. Tia is the learned sage and seeming leader of the group. And Lakshi is the young protagonist, which while a little naive and impulsive, has her heart in the right place. Of all of these, I want to say that Lakshi is the most developed and arguably the main character, although they're all fine for 54-minute characters. And while it could be complained that they don't really do that much, or that there is a lack of action in the OVA, I do want to point out that this is probably for animation budget reasons, and that they are characterized as nomads and not warriors. The looters too are relatively simple, but relatively competent, although I do question their wardrobe decisions and wonder if the bald part is mandatory before joining the gang. It should be noted though that even with its somewhat somber tone at times, the piece is still a fun one, and it does have a couple more quirks I wanted to briefly touch on. For one, the whole movie feels like an animated Dungeons & Dragons session to me, complete with weird settings, failed spells, and weird BS enemy deaths that someone had to come up with at the last minute to save the party. I love the creativity present, as this sort of chaotic creativity in this OVA seems like something that would come out of a DM and player's quest to constantly out-BS each other, all the while having fun doing so and exploring creative outlets for constructing a fantasy world. It really does feel like something I can see happening over a session of Dungeons & Dragons, and at least for me, I found that to be enchanting. Finally, while I haven't seen the dub of this movie, the only DVD I could find was the Spanish version at a flea market, the credits are still quite interesting, as they do credit the director of the English dub as VA's Michael Cernaclas and Sean Schemmel. That's right everyone, Goku made a movie, and a pretty good one at that. Now obviously the movie was made before it could receive a dub, and these two are only credited for directing the English version, so I'm pretty sure they only oversaw like the dubbing and that's it, but still, it's pretty cool that Goku has a director's credit. And The Weathering Continent itself is a pretty cool OVA. While the reviews for it online seem relatively mixed, if not somewhat negative for some reason, I don't really understand this, as I found the film to be a fun and measured 54 minutes of art. Yes, you could make the argument that it is somewhat style over substance, but it's definitely very artistic, and there's definitely some substance here. Its cast isn't anything super standout, sure, its plot is kind of simple, yes, and it's not the deepest piece, true, but it does have some substance in addition to an amazing art and sound. Its technicals definitely are enough to elevate the still very competent elements of the series, and it doesn't fall to OVA syndrome and manages to put on a very fun performance. It is still a great, obscure anime memory